Good morning, everyone. My name is Vanessa McDonnell, and I am co-director of the U Ottawa Public Law Center. And on behalf of the center and the Interdisciplinary Research Lab on the Rights of the Child, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar this morning. A few things before we get started. One is to acknowledge the land that the University of Ottawa is on today, and to pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of their land. We acknowledge today their longstanding relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. I'd also like to let you know that this session is available in both English and in French. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see an interpretation icon, which will allow you to listen to the session either in English or in French. If for whatever reason you don't see that interpretation button, it may be that you need to update your version of Zoom to the current version. So just a little bit of troubleshooting there. Before I hand things over to our moderator, Christine Gervais, who is a criminologist at the University of Ottawa and a member of the Interdisciplinary Research Lab on the Rights of the Child, I'd like to just say a little something about, excuse me, the impetus for today's session. One of the sort of inspirations for today's session was the release in 2021 of the first State of Youth report by the Canadian government. And we're so privileged today to have two of the people who were involved, closely involved in the writing of the report with us today. And so that's really sort of one inspiration, this new report that looks closely at the experiences of youth in our country today. And really highlights the importance of youth leadership and the ways that youth are contributing in meaningful ways to governance in our country. The other inspiration is perhaps a less positive one, and that is the experience of young people during the COVID-19 pandemic, and in many ways the failure of adults and governments to properly protect the rights of children, including the right to education. And so we're at a moment now where I think it's fair to say that youth leadership is more important than ever, and where we need to have new conversations about how we're going to make sure that the interests of children are at the heart of our public policy and at the heart of governance. And so I'll turn things over to Christine, but only to say that we have among us today a group of people who, many of whom have spent decades thinking about these issues, and who I think are very well positioned to talk about some of these important issues facing us today. Christine.
Thank you, Vanessa. Good morning, everyone. As a co-host for today's session, it's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Interdisciplinary Research Laboratory on the Rights of the Child, which was created in 2007 within the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa, and benefits from the ongoing collaboration with the Human Rights Research and Education Centre, as well as from various faculties throughout the University of Ottawa community. Our mandate is to promote and to foster research and collaboration in the areas of children's rights and children's well-being, with the intention of better contributing to protection of the rights of children, both locally, nationally, as well as internationally. And we coordinate a range of activities throughout the year, including an annual spring conference, and as well as a course, an interdisciplinary course, a graduate course that's offered within the university or at the University of Ottawa on the rights of the child. That we also host an essay competition for both undergraduate and graduate students, and we engage in international and local engagement with collaboration with research and community partners. And we also host the noon hour or speaker series webinars just like this one today. So as we're pleased to be collaborating today with the Public Law Center with the University of Ottawa, and with whom we've co-organized this panel discussion on children's rights and youth leadership in times of the COVID-19 pandemic. After the main presentations, Professor Mona Paré will be moderating a Q&A discussion, and after which audience members are welcome to ask your questions by putting them into the Q&A box. And then you can do so throughout the sessions as they come to mind. And then Vanessa will be dropping them into the chat box, and then I will be sharing them with the panelists for them to respond to as our time allows. So our first panelist this morning is Senator Rosemary Moodie, who was appointed to the Senate of Canada in 2018. She is a nationally and internationally recognized medical leader, pediatrician, and neonatologist. Her research has focused on the social determinants of breastfeeding practice, and she has written extensively on regional health services and physician human resource planning. As a senator, she has consistently advocated for the interests of women and children. Our exemplary youth leaders today are Jana, Jandal, Alrifai, who is a university student and climate justice organizer with Fridays for Future in Windsor, Essex, and Climate Strike Canada. She was a member of the Youth Advisory Group for the first ever federal State of Youth report. Taylor Behn-Tsakoza is a Dene woman from the Fort Nelson First Nation in British Columbia in Treaty 8 territory. She is co-chair of the Assembly of First Nations National Youth Council, and she is the female youth representative of the British Columbia Assembly of First Nations. She also works as a community educator, and she is passionate about elevating youth voices and addressing the need for programs that connect youth to culture and community. Today's moderator for the discussion is Mona Paré, who is a full professor and Vice Dean of Graduate Studies at the University of Ottawa's Faculty of Law. She is also the director of the Interdisciplinary Research Laboratory on the Rights of the Child, and her research interests include children's rights and the rights of persons with disabilities, as well as the implementation of international law in domestic law. Now, Senator Moodie, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone today. Hello, I'm Rosemary Moodie. I'm a senator from Ontario, and I'd like to thank the organizers for your invitation to participate and to thank my co-panelists for being here today. Discussions like these for me are vital because despite the dire situation that we know are facing Canadian children and youth, often they are left out of our policy debates. And to put it bluntly, frankly, they are not made a priority. In setting the stage for this discussion today, I had just a few comments to make. First, let me celebrate with you Canada's first ever State of the Youth report. I believe it's very important, and it's a very important first step in amplifying the voice of Canada's children. In thinking about this report, I reflected quite a bit on the UNICEF report card, which you're all probably familiar with, number 16, and some of the lessons from that report card as well. We learned then that Canada's children are doing poorly compared to our international counterparts. We're 30th out of the 38 OECD countries on overall well-being, 31st in mental health and happiness, 30th in physical health and survival, and 26th in child poverty. Overall, this report painted a grim picture. And today, what we see is more of that picture. The State of Youth report has very effectively brought our focus again to some of the major problems that our children are facing. In this report, we see that young people are focused on important issues: reconciliation, health, education, and climate change. They value their right to grow up in a healthy society and are championing progress where older generations have failed. What I hear them saying in this report is that they are not satisfied with the status quo. We must do better. In fact, these two reports are among many in the past few decades that show conclusively that the current trajectory of Canada's children and youth well-being is on a downward slope. And so far, little has been really done to reverse this trend. As the authors acknowledge in the State of the Youth report, this is a beginning. And I reflect on this. How do we build on this beginning? This is where I believe an independent federal advocate could play an important role. Children should not depend on the whims of the government of the day, to have their voices heard. They deserve a predictable, ongoing, and independent process that ensures that their voices are heard regularly and that their viewpoints are clearly understood. Within this process, we also need to prioritize the voices of those children who are unable to vote, the less than 18-year-olds. We need to make sure that these reports are also reflective of the challenges they face and their priorities. A federal advocate would make all the difference in amplifying the voices of children, challenging governments and public institutions, driving real and meaningful change. So I'll end there. Thank you for your attention and for the invitation to be with you today. And I look forward to a very robust discussion this morning.
Our second panelist, Jana, can begin.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here today. I first would like to acknowledge that I'm a settler on the land of the Three Fires Nations of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which include the Ojibwa, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. And this is the ceded territory covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. And I recognize that land acknowledgements are just a simple first step towards reconciliation. So throughout my speech, I'm going to talk a bit about the impact of the climate crisis on youth leadership, especially in terms of the climate movement and organizing within the lights of COVID-19. So as we all know, the climate crisis stems from the overexertion of our Earth's resources and with no regard to its survival and sustainability of those resources. Our focus on gaining capital and more profit has made it impossible for other things to matter, like our right to life and our right to a healthy environment. The capitalism and the inequalities they create very much lead into the climate crisis, and especially to the lack of action to solve it. Somewhere in the back, I have a poster that says capitalism is not healthy for children and other living things. And I think that very much encapsulates my point here, and that really shows in the climate crisis within it as well. The climate crisis impacts youth because, simply, we will not have a future if the Earth isn't here. We won't have a planet to survive on, let alone have a future on. But we're impacted in more deeper ways currently, not just in the future, because the climate crisis is here. For example, this past summer, Canada experienced record high temperatures and floods and forest fires. And this impacted predominantly BIPOC communities and youth in those communities. Many of my friends had to spend their days inside bailing water out of their basements, especially where I am located here in Windsor, Essex, and our location to nearby lakes and rivers. My friends in BC could not leave their houses because of the worsening air quality, because of the forest fires. Now think about what if this happened during the school year, which it has before and will continue to happen. Well, how their education would be impacted, or how, what if they're so scared to get out of the house because maybe something would happen to their house, or other things like that. We've seen a lot of youth experience climate anxiety, especially in the past year, in record high numbers. And they feel, and we all feel, helplessness towards the current state of the world, especially when it comes to the climate crisis, because it is such a big thing and we see no action, no sustainable, no real action. And if there is, it's rarely ever followed through. But we continue to see youth in the climate movement mobilizing each other and coercing politicians and leaders to actually implement meaningful and radical climate action, and to hold corporations accountable for their destruction of the world. Youth around the world saw the lack of action and did something about it. It's quite unfortunate that we have to do this ourselves, that we have to spend our days calling for action. We have forged for ourselves platforms and passed light to spotlight our climate and environment. The thing with youth leadership, in my opinion, is that we're not waiting for someone to give it to us. It is not something given to the youth, but it is something that we've made. It is an opportunity we have made for ourselves. And the adult allies that have been with us throughout this time have been much appreciated, especially with their support and resources and advice. But, you know, climate action is logical and right and simple. Why aren't we doing anything about it? And a lot of the time we see, interestingly, adults would march with us. For example, in 2019, during the global climate strikes, Justin Trudeau marched in Montreal, and he shouted with us, climate action, as if he himself isn't the one responsible for it. And yet we see no action from him or other politicians and leaders around. They applaud us to be inspirational and courageous, but do nothing for them back. Especially, for example, just yesterday, the United Nations said it cannot rule on the case brought from children activists from around the world because it simply could not find a causal link between CO2 emissions and harm. They said it didn't matter, it's not a human right violation, and we should find a different way to bring it to the UN. But still, they saluted the courage and determination of the petitioners, but did nothing more. So it's quite sad in that respect. If you believe that we were doing the right thing and we're doing the courageous thing, then where is the action? But in terms of COVID-19, which had exacerbated the inequalities and the injustices we have seen in our societies and we've experienced, both on a national and international level, it kind of also showed us the weakened environment can also weaken the people. For example, Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health talked about the possible links between climate change and the spread of infectious disease like COVID-19, talking about how diseases like Lyme disease and mosquito-borne diseases such as malaria are more likely to be transferred, especially after loss of habitat and you know, the meetings between species that are nowhere near each other because of those migration. Over the past year, I've seen myself and other climate activists and none of my friends talk about and advocate for not going back to normal, because normal was a crisis and is a crisis. We've advocated for a just recovery from COVID-19 under the framework of a just transition away from fossil fuels and into a green economy. And because for too many years, people say we can't do anything about climate change because what about the economy? But when the economy was halted and we've had an opportunity to again do climate action, we saw nothing. And it is, again, so disappointing. Online organizing, though, made it easier for us to bother and harass politicians, you know, flood their emails, flood their tweet mentions. They've allowed us to connect with other climate organizers, and especially for BIPOC and youth people or people in small communities, online organizing allowed us to dip our toes into organizing and help us figure out a way to be more involved in a safer, easier manner. Since 2020, this past summer, we've had our first global in-person climate strike, and it was marvelous to once again shout in the streets and strike. But we've learned very important information. We've learned very important systems on how to, again, continuously use social media for our right and for our ability to have a future. And that's kind of how we saw the State of Youth report getting circulated. That's how we saw information about different social justice issues get circulated and people learned more about it. What I've learned over the years is that youth will adapt to changes and we will continue to grow as leaders until those in positions of power actually take action to solve what plagues us in terms of climate, social, and economic justices. And thanks so much for listening to me, and hope you learned something. And I'll hand it back to Christine.
Thank you to both Senator Rosemary Moodie as well as to Jana for your compelling arguments. And now we'll hear from Taylor with her stirring insights.
Must see Christine, and it's good to see you, Jana. I miss your energy and really your expertise in the topic. So must see, thank you for enlightening us all. Nega Dagundi Sadikla Taylor Behn-Tsakoza Ote. Good morning, everyone. My name is Taylor Behn-Tsakoza. I'm calling in today from my own territory. I'm still learning how to acknowledge my own territory, but I'm coming to you from Dene Day, the land of the people, land of the Dene here in northern BC, Treaty 8 territory. It's good to be here. And as I was like listening to our first two panelists talk about from climate to the State of Youth report, which I was a part of, I was thinking about what this panel is about, and it's about COVID-19 and youth leadership. And I think I'll talk maybe more to the youth leadership part, as that's, I think, I'm a jack of all trades, master of none kind of person. And so, but I think youth leadership is kind of where I thrive and like to really dedicate my time to. So as mentioned in my intro, I am the co-chair for the National Youth Council at the Assembly of First Nations. And in that position, it's my role to really be a spokesperson for Indigenous youth at both the national level at the Assembly of First Nations and in numerous opportunities such as the State of Youth Report. And in this role, I am expected to bring what I'm passionate about and what I really care about, but as well as including all of the voices across Canada when it comes to First Nations youth. So it's at times is a challenge, but I'm really honored to hold this position. And I've done this position throughout COVID-19. I became part of the BCFN last November, and I was appointed to the co-chair position in June. So all virtual. I've never met anyone I've worked with. The State of Youth Report, we did completely virtual as well. And so it's been a really interesting time to see, one, how children and youth voices are being heard and represented at decision-making tables. And as well, just it's been really an honor, I would say, to hear the stories of youth about what we've been dealing with throughout this pandemic. And we know that COVID-19 has overshadowed a lot of epidemics we've been dealing with in this country, from the opioid crisis, climate change. I don't know if anyone or if people are up to speed with UNDRIP, but I know from a First Nations perspective, from a First Nations youth perspective, UNDRIP has been moving along and it's been kind of quiet. So I've been trying to really use my position to advocate for all of the things. Back earlier this year, I was part of Indigenized Descendant event where I brought forward the experiences of First Nations people when it came to the opioid crisis. And I participated in a policy hackathon with the Canadian Roots Exchange on UNDRIP. And so finding these opportunities to really use my voice on things that matter, although they're there, it seems that, you know, the same people come to the events, which is fine. I think when people are passionate, when people like have the credentials to be a part of those things, that's great. But we know that there are a lot of voices missing from those conversations. And I don't think that I'm still searching for the answer of how do we become more inclusive, and how do we include the voices that aren't there. And yeah, I think COVID-19 adds a really complicated layer to a lot of things, but I think when it comes to the specific issue of including youth voices, that's definitely part of it. I'll quickly touch on the State of Youth report that Jana and I were both a part of. And I just want to shout out Jessica Ward-King, who's also on the call. She was a big part of helping us just navigate all the data that was presented to us to write the State of Youth report. So I just want to shout her out. I was part of the health pillar, our section rather, in the report. And again, although I'm supposed to be representing all youth across Canada, coming from a northern community, I'm really passionate about health, just because, and if you read the State of Youth report, you'll see in the health section, there was four subsections within that, and that was access to care, the cost of care. Oh, now I'm really testing myself. I shouldn't have named them off. I believe we touched on COVID-19, but COVID-19 was an entire other section. And I believe just more holistic care, if I remember correctly. But yeah, it was yeah, coming from I think from an Indigenous perspective, holistic health is part of what we strive as Indigenous people to achieve, but also just the access to health. So yeah, I think any space I'm a part of, I like to try and bring my own experience, but also being part of the numerous projects and groups I have been, just listening to the stories of my fellow group members and like being able to bring that forward to other spaces has really been yeah, what really drives me and what really fulfills what I'm doing. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. I know it's kind of everywhere, but youth leadership is needed, I guess. And I know you'll hear this catchphrase of nothing for us without us. And there's people like myself and Jana who are really advocating for that. So yeah, Masi, thanks.
Thank you very much, Taylor, and again to Senator Moodie and Jana for your insightful comments. Now we will, in the next segment, turn it over to Professor Paré, who will be leading the discussion in a Q&A format. And as we mentioned earlier, any audience members who would like to ask any questions to the panelists, you may do so within the Q&A box, and then we'll ask those to the panelists as time allows.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you to all the panelists. I'll just say a few words about children's rights before I start asking questions to our experts here. And I've just been listening to you, and so yeah, issues you raised, they actually all concern rights that are guaranteed in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. That is an international treaty ratified by Canada, but that has not been incorporated into Canadian legislation. It is protected through different ways in Canada, but not directly incorporated. Also, not everything that you mentioned is like explicitly there. There was no explicit recognition of the right to the environment or anything about pandemics or epidemics for that matter, or youth leadership and governance. And this was a treaty that was drafted in the 1980s. However, all those issues you've raised do concern rights that are guaranteed there. There is the right for children. When I say children, the convention concerns everyone under the age of majority, but then the age of 18. But obviously here in this session, we'll talk about children and youth. So the right for children to express themselves on issues that concern them, that is directly related to youth leadership and youth governance, youth having a voice about issues that concern them. There is obviously the right to health and access to health services, and this is all related to what's happening with the pandemic, and also related to the right to environment. There is no express right to the environment, but even the right to health, actually, Article 24 of the Convention, asks states to take into consideration the dangers and risks of environmental pollution. So there was already some conscience of the issues, environmental issues, and the risks posed to children. So there are many convention rights that are actually or potentially violated in this pandemic situation. Obviously, what comes to mind first is the right to health. There are the health risks. We don't still know everything about the impact of COVID-19 on children. Also, there's the issue of lack of available vaccine for most children. There's been a lack of access to other health services, critical health services for children and youth, because hospitals and clinics have been overstretched and COVID-19 patients have been prioritized. There's been also, transition to virtual healthcare, which is it's a good thing that it was made available, but it is not the same for most people as in-person appointments. And of course, health includes mental health, and mental health has been a big piece during the pandemic, and especially for adolescents who've been isolated, lacking social connections, increased screen time, lack of physical activity, lack of extracurricular activities, sports, music, and others. Also, food insecurity is related to health. no access to school food programs, and financial instability in the families, and so on. Another right that has been mentioned in relation to children and the pandemic is, of course, the right to education. So school closures, of course, have affected all children, but not all children in the same way. Not everybody has access to the same education opportunities at home in their community. So much depends on the type of home, on access to educational material, technology, good quality internet access. Even the language used at home makes a difference for children. And as a mother, I know that even when schools are open, there's so many restrictions in schools that the quality of education has definitely not been the same as in regular times, and the schools have been operating really on a minimal delivery model in these last couple of years. And for youth, you could also talk about education and training, including access to professional training and generally finding a job. I know it's been hard for youth to find harder for youth to find a job these days. Another issue that came up a lot, it's really serious, is the right to protection from violence and abuse and exploitation and neglect. And there's been many concerns with children not accessing those programs outside of home, no school, no daycare. So they've been lacking the safety net that they might usually have, and especially with parents who might be experiencing additional stressors. There might be increased substance abuse, employment loss, overcrowding in the house, even increased screen time for children and youth, which means they're could be exposed to harmful material or predators. So lots of increased risks with this, stay safe, stay home, that we thought it would be safe for everybody to stay home. And for children, what's very important is the right to development, and that includes so much. If you think of younger children and the lack of socialization opportunities, what does it mean for a young child not to be able to meet people, play with children of different ages, more difficult access to early childhood education programs, even libraries closed? I think that has affected a lot of children and their development. And then the right to, in the Convention on the Right of the Child, we have a right to play, and that includes the right to rest, leisure, recreational activities. And of course, you can think of the lockdowns. In many places, even the playgrounds, parks, sports fields were closed or been more difficult to access, clubs, sports, again, back to the extracurricular activities that I mentioned. And in fact, these are just a few rights. All rights could be cited because the pandemic has caused just an amplification also of existing problems, highlighted and intensified inequalities between children, groups of children and youth. So something I wanted to mention just before I go on to the questions also is the importance of research. So obviously I'm talking from an academic setting, but it's something that we need to work on together. Research is important. There's not that much that we know still about the impact, medium, long term, of the pandemic on children. We don't really know yet what are the areas that are really most of concern. Is it physical health, mental health, education, safety? What we do to improve the situation and to mitigate the harm on children? And what are impacts on specific groups of children? Not all groups of children are affected in the same way. What about children with disabilities, Indigenous children, children of a certain age, young children, adolescents, migrants and refugees, and so on? So research is important. We need collaboration between different disciplines, different specialists, like in a lockdown situation and school closure. As you know, this affects us so much. It affects education, health, safety, development. So we need collaboration between different specialists and disciplines, and we need collaboration also with children and youth. It's those who are concerned. Youth are experts of their own lives. They have clear opinions on where priorities should lie, and a good understanding of the complexities of everything, of society they live in. And so that's why I want to hear more from you, from our experts, because you are all better placed to talk about problems and possible solutions. So we do have some questions for each of the panelists. I'll ask these questions, and after that we can take questions from the participants, from the audience. So I will start with Senator Moodie, who can elaborate on some of the questions I raised about health problems, impacts on specific groups, and possible solutions. And then I'll turn to our youth experts, who can tell us a bit more about the priorities from their perspectives and how young people can contribute to improving the situation for children and youth, and how we can help them do that. So, Senator Moodie, you are a pediatrician and a neonatologist, so you are very well placed to speak to the science. Could you tell us how COVID really impacts children, and what's the difference between children and adults? Are they similarly vulnerable?
Thank you for your question, Professor. So we do know a little bit now about, we've had enough time to track and to understand some of the science in terms of how children are affected compared to adults. In general, what we know is that children seem to be milder affected in a milder course of illness from COVID than adults do. They seem to exhibit less of that hyper-inflammatory response that we see in adults that sets the adult up for more severe disease. What that means is, and we're seeing it very much in the data, that while children make up about 20% of cases during the pandemic here in Canada, and this was a September more recent tally of where things were at, when you compare to the United States, very similar, 19%. Only 1% of children were actually hospitalized with COVID, and very rarely did children die, 0.1% of children, and I'm talking about the age group 0 to 19. But I think from the point of view, we are seeing some specific vaccine side effects that are being watched very carefully around children, and also very small numbers of children who have a reaction to the vaccine, which we see for all vaccines. And it's part of our life as pediatricians to tell parents about the fact that while vaccines are very safe, there can be occasionally and generally in very small numbers reactions. So we're watching those reactions for children as well, and they're, as I said, few and very limited. So it appears that as we look at what's coming, that there is right now before our own authorities the vaccine for children 0 to 11 years, and that hopefully will soon be approved. It's already been approved, as everyone is well aware, over 12 years of age. So for me, that knowledge of the science is one thing. I think the concern that all of us have, and has been well stated already this morning, is the broader impact. Beyond the burden of illness from COVID, there are some of the impacts that are harder to track, harder to identify, harder to quantify and understand their role in the future of our children. We know Statistics Canada and the Chief Science Advisor have reported on things like the unseen mental and physical impacts of lockdowns and school closures, the impact of poorer socioeconomic outcomes and how these are affecting our children, delayed access to healthcare. We heard about thousands of kids are waiting for elective surgeries that have been put aside until the pressure on hospitals have been relieved. All of these causing reduced quality of life for our children. On the upside, yes, we've seen children getting vaccinated, 74%, just over 74% of 12 to 17-year-olds are fully vaccinated now. And as I pointed out, we're moving towards approval for vaccines. At the same time, we are struggling with what seems to be an increasing concern around disinformation around vaccines, and that is going to be a problem for us to deal with as a country. Nonetheless, I think the impacts of COVID have been profound, and the State of Youth report has provided some really important areas for focus, especially the considerations around investing further in our mental health systems for care. That will be very important. So I'll pause there.
Thank you for that. That's really interesting. And we are hoping that definitely that vaccine will be available to younger children soon. Then I want to ask you, Senator Moodie, as you serve as the co-chair for the Parliamentary Black Caucus and the chair of the African Canadian Senate Group, what is your view of the impact of this pandemic on racialized kids? So coming back to the idea that the impact might be different on different groups of children.
Certainly, and you made mention of a few of those groups before. One of the things, the areas that we focused on as part of the African Canadian Senate Group really has been what's the impact been on racialized children. Children have faced the brunt of the pandemic. We all recognize that because whatever difficulties adults and parents encounter, they trickle down to children. All of these factors especially affect Black Canadians who are themselves a group that are particularly vulnerable. So things like food insecurity has magnified quite significantly. We talked about safe places, but schools are also places where food programs provide a significant amount of steady, reliable food for children. So just the interruption of going to school has made the situation for our children, and especially children of color, Black children, an issue. Economic hardship, yes, parents can't bring home as much money. And because one parent, usually the mom, has to stay home to watch the kids, there is decreased amount of money available. And so our children are experiencing economic hardship through that trickle-down effect. Learning, yes, some kids don't have the supports to do school from home. You need good access to internet, you need technology, you need parents who can sit and support the child in the process. And all of these are challenges for many Black families, Black Canadians. But beyond that, we look at all of these issues and we think about the fact that they're being felt to a greater degree. And when we look at the future, we see that they will struggle more with fewer supports to make up the gaps, to do well in school now that they have lost 2 years of effective schooling, of high quality schooling. We'll see long-term impacts on job prospects, on economic prosperity. And we also see that the need for special attention to be paid to these families is really not there. So there are a few very promising policies on the horizon that would certainly help, childcare being one of those. High quality childcare would be something that would help the situation as an example. So again, I'll stop there because I could really keep going. Like many of us, we have a lot to say about this.
Thank you for your answer, and also noting that there are initiatives and possible solutions like the childcare. And that's actually my final question to you here is that you have been advocating for a federal commissioner or advocate for children and youth, which Canada is lacking. What do you believe would be the role of such an advocate, and would this role have been beneficial during the pandemic if we'd had such an advocate or commissioner?
So yes, that for me is a very important question. We really do understand, and we know that there is little meaningful representation for children in our policymaking process. That's a huge problem. It's been identified for us as a country over the past 10 years, and we still face the challenge. We have excellent organizations that mobilize and advocate outside the parliament, but little within the parliament. So what would a child advocate do for this issue? Well, I'd propose there are a few key things. The first is to play the role in the legislative process in a similar way to, say, the parliamentary budget officer. The PBO lets us know the impact of policy on the budget. A federal advocate would let us know the effect of policy on children by using tools, very well understood tools like the Child Impact Assessment. In this way, children become a much more important part of our legislative debate. The second important role for the federal advocate would be to raise awareness on the issues children are facing in a systematic way, in an ongoing way, in a reliable and predictable way. This would be key. This would have been key during the pandemic when the voice of children was silent for a very long period of time. And it would be ongoing. It would not just be that idea of a frequent check-in from time to time by a willing government, as the government felt it was indicated. One pervasive issue that we face and still face, and you mentioned it, Professor, is the lack of data. That throughout this pandemic, there's been too little research and very little data on children that's reliable and comparative during the pandemic. A federal advocate for children would help parliamentarians understand what children are facing and contribute to the push for institutions to do more to collect data. And the final thing I'll mention is the federal advocate would really be have the important role of amplifying the voice of our youth, our children, and to facilitate the encounters between youth and parliamentarians while fostering a greater participation of young people in the legislative process. I really loved reading the State of the Youth report because I believe that these initiatives should occur. But once a report such as this is published, there needs to be a mechanism to challenge the government and to prod it into action. A federal advocate could play this role.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Senator Moodie. I'll turn on now to our young leaders and experts. And perhaps, Jana, first, you have talked to us about your involvement in climate action. So you're a young environmentalist and a youth leader. And can you tell us about more about how it was to be involved in climate action during the pandemic specifically?
Yeah, for sure. So the bulk of my activism in terms of climate justice has been throughout COVID. And that's when I really got involved with Climate Strike Canada, and that's when I really co-founded Fridays for Future Windsor-Essex and became part of the Windsor-Essex Climate Council. All of these initiatives started popping up throughout COVID, and I think the reason for that is because we were home and we had the time and the ability, a lot of us, for the first time to really look at the world around us and see what's happening, and we had more chances to get involved and more time and more accessibility to get involved. Like for me, for example, it'd be a bit more harder for me to get involved in things if I had to, make sure that I have rights to the meeting places to organize versus just log on to Zoom. It also, expanded our networks and allowed us to connect with more activists, not just within Canada, but within the globe. But in general, I have been doing a lot of things in uplifting climate justice, especially here in Windsor, Essex. I've been working on getting, for the first time, separated bike lanes in Windsor. I've been working on, a just recovery and the global climate strikes. There's one happening on October 22nd. So I implore people to go and see if there's one happening in their town or city. And if there isn't, reach out to Climate Strike Canada, or you can reach out to me or any group near you, and we'll help you organize one. Because climate action, no matter how small or how big, is important. And we need to continuously implore and, bully our politicians to do what's right, because they won't do it on their own, as it seems.
Thanks. It's great to see how youth, even though we've said it's been a really difficult time, the pandemic, but how youth have been so resilient, and they're finding ways to connect and actually act during these times using online platforms and so on. Could you just tell us also a bit more about why you think that climate change is particularly important for children's rights?
Yeah, as you have mentioned, we have a right to our environment. We have the right to live. We have the right to play. We have the right to do everything that we want, and everything. That's what we deserve as youth, as people, and as kids. And when you take away the very basis of our life, nothing matters anymore, because we can't do anything anymore. We can't go out because the air quality is too bad. We can't have a future because the earth is dying and we're letting it die. It's very vitally important that we realize that the destruction of the environment isn't just like, oh, it's the destruction of the environment, but it is a crime against humanity. As it is ecocide, and it should be recognized as a crime against humanity, because it is the destruction of humanity and our rights that go with it.
Yeah, as you rightly say, it affects everything, right? Everything for children today and the children's future, and the children becoming adolescents and then adults, and the environment is actually linked to everything that we can do. Now I'll turn to Taylor, and Taylor, you have a lot of experience as a youth leader. Could you tell us a bit about your involvement in governance as a First Nation youth?
Yeah, definitely. I guess most of my involvement has come through the Assembly First Nations, which is a political organization here in Canada. And yeah, governance. In like a really sophisticated way, it's been through the AFN and being in meetings and events related to the AFN. But governance, I also have a lot of board experience, and especially through COVID. And I think COVID has been such a, I don't know, it's an interesting time in ways. There have been good things that come out of it, and other ways not at all. But I think what Jana was saying about some children and youth have the time and are able to jump and have a computer and have internet and are able to jump and take part in these opportunities. And I'm fortunate to be one of them, to have all those resources to me, that I'm able to use my voice on the boards I sit on, with my involvement with the AFN. And I think, yeah, it's been interesting. I think, especially during COVID, I'm also part of a lot of, a lot of circles that really emphasize youth voices, but I know the boards I sit on are specific youth, they're seeking youth board members. And so I don't know if it's pressure from maybe it's the State of Youth report, but I think just like this overall movement that youth are like, we want to be involved, like create space for us and be willing to mentor us. I think that's been the biggest part of my governance journey throughout COVID is like, I don't know what I'm doing. Can someone help me? And I've been really lucky that I've had those people who've come forward who are like, yeah, like let's, like I'll show you what I know. And like let's continue to, you know, to create more spaces for youth. Cause I think it's just like, cause every time I sit on a board or at the AFN, it's like, okay, there's only one of me here. How can we get like, you know, more of us around this table and more youth? And so, yeah, it's been interesting. COVID is, yeah, very interesting.
Thanks, Taylor. I wanted to ask you quite a specific questions about health because you've been involved in different organizations while working for Indigenous kids and youth, including First Nations Health Authority. What's needed to help First Nations children and youth enjoy their right to health, according to you?
Oh, good question. Can you read the first part of that question? What do I?
So just generally, what do you think is needed to help First Nations children to and youth to enjoy their right to health, knowing that you've worked, you know, in communities, you know, and you've done also community education, and you've worked with Indigenous kids and youth.
Yeah, definitely. What I think is needed, I mean, kind of referring to the State of Youth report about access and different kinds of health, like telehealth and just support to travel to appointments, like all those really, I think, important and logistical things. But I think when it comes to First Nations children, what is needed, I think, is really a holistic and land-based approach to health. We know, coming from like my perspective as a Dene person, a lot of our traditions and culture is rooted in our land, and that includes health. And whether it's using our traditional medicines or just viewing health in a way, like Western health in a way that that really like heals our, like the four parts of ourselves, so our mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical. So what I think is needed is just like how, like including land, like language and culture, and then like fostering those four realms, four parts of ourselves is really like what's gonna, I don't know, what's gonna heal us.
Thanks, that's excellent. So yeah, the holistic approach to health and also access. I think access is an issue for sure. And then I have a question to both of you. Could you tell us a bit more about your participation in the youth report, the youth advisory group of the State of the Youth report? This is the first time it's been done in Canada. So is there something that really struck you in that exercise? What would you take out of that exercise? Do you want to start, Taylor, and then maybe Jana can continue? Yeah.
Oh, I feel like there's so many. I think I mentioned it earlier about like working virtually was just really interesting. Like I've never met Jana, I've never met Jessica, I believe there was 12 or 13 of us that made up our advisory committee that drafted the State of Youth report. And there was times we were meeting like 2 times a week. So it was like, for some of us who were doing school, for myself, I was working virtually as well. It was a lot. But I think it was, I don't know, when you get like-minded people in a room, such as our committee, who was just really passionate and just, I don't know, just so energized to get this State of Youth report out so that Canadians knew how we were doing, and also the federal government. I know Senator Moodie, you mentioned having I don't remember the word you said, like an advocate at the federal level to like, how do we implement what we said in the report? I think that's when at our final meeting, that was a question, was like, okay, now what like how like, and I know like there's going to be follow-up, and like we're going to continually try and find ways of how this can be, how all the things in the State of Youth Report can be addressed. But yeah, that was definitely an experience.
Yeah, it definitely was a good experience. I felt it was a lot of work, but at the same time, it was like important work. I felt like this work is going to a final product, and hopefully this final product is informative, and also, you know, we have recommendations there. We didn't just say what's wrong. We gave you some solutions, and we hope to figure out different ways to continue to push for those solutions and those recommendations, knowing that these are just small start steps for recommendations, not necessarily this final solution, but there were good solutions as well. I really enjoyed working with the youth advisory group, and I really enjoyed listening and learning about all the different experiences that people had. You know, I really, I worked on the climate action part of it, surprise. And I really liked going through the data and seeing how people felt about different things, and the accessibility of climate action, and how they viewed the climate crisis. So yeah, I'm really glad the State of Youth Report is out, and hopefully this is the first, but not the last.
So it's what you're saying is action is needed now. Action is needed. And so how do you think that youth could be better involved in governance? Because this is one example, but we know that youth are not systematically involved in governance. And as Senator Moodie said it earlier on, you know, children and youth are actually left out of policy debates generally. That is the situation. So how could they be better involved? And then I think I have, after that, a question for all of you, including Senator Moodie. It's how can we all, in our different roles, facilitate youth leadership? Jana, do you want to start?
Sure, I can start. So from my experience, there are youth-only groups. There are youth, you know, circles that we organize in, and there are a lot of adult ones, just full-on adults. And a lot of times, adults try to invite like a single youth in and say, "This is representation. This is youth voice." But as a youth, it is quite overwhelming to go into a place full of people who are like 20, 30 years older than me, and expect me to be the voice of all of the youth, which in no way I am, or I could be. So I think we need to have a little in between, little adult plus youth circles, where it's not just one youth, it's a good amount of youth there, so that we can not only support each other, but we could have a more holistic understanding of what the youth want, because there are different people from different socioeconomic backgrounds and different general backgrounds, and those need to be, you know, told and put up on in those places of governance. So yeah, don't come into the youth spaces, but don't just throw us all into the adult spaces. I think there's a nice little middle ground there, of how we should be involved in governance. And I think compensation for those youth, especially BIPOC youth, is important, because you can't expect BIPOC youth to, you know, if they're working a job, for them to survive, you can't expect them to let it all out and just go do something for free instead, no matter how that would be important to them. But we need to compensate people for their work.
That's great. So compensation, and yeah, I think what you raised also touches upon the risk of tokenism too. So when you think, okay, we just need a representative, you know, for this group and this group and this group, you check the boxes. Yeah. Taylor, you have something to share?
Yeah, excuse me. I definitely agree with everything what Jana said, especially about compensation. Like that, like I would definitely put that maybe towards the top if there was a list. But I would also, I think it kind of touches on both questions you asked, just having it youth led. I think if you ask any youth, like just asking like what do you want? What do you need? How can we support you? Most of the time, we have the answer, and it's just, I know with a lot of conversations I've been a part of, it's not necessarily that we want to do it ourselves, but like for for like grants and like money to like run our own events and own opportunities to engage other youth, I think has been like what I've been hearing a lot of is like actually like just support us in like doing like our own events so that we can engage youth. I think in most cases I don't know, youth like to, it's like in our state of youth report, for example, it was chaired by 2 other youth, our meetings were. So it was just like with some staff who were just there to support, and that's how we got the state of youth. Like that's how we analyzed that, drafted the report, reviewed it, and then submitted it. And it was all just youth led, and it just worked out. And I think that's where we were most successful, was like, we got this. And you mentioned that like we're the experts in our own experiences, and I think that couldn't be more true.
So yeah, I totally hear that. Everybody can support youth-led events and initiatives. Thank you for that, Taylor. Senator Moodie, what do you think we can do to facilitate youth leadership?
Thank you for the question. So, as I listened to the inspiring comments from both our panelists, I thank you. Thanks for sharing your thoughts with us, and thank you for leading us. You will tell us what we need to do, but from my perspective, I also have some thoughts. We need, those of us in positions of influence and that can make things happen, need to help youth build your voice, their own voice. We need to help them build their own opportunities. And you'll notice my language. I'm not suggesting that we know the answers, but that they're self-identified opportunities, and that we encourage those and give those who have succeeded in finding their voice and in finding those opportunities to help others find, to scale it up, if you will, across Canada, so that where there are areas of expertise, people can benefit from them, where there are, and expertise can be as simple as get in touch with us, we'll help you do the work, as you pointed out, Jana, and offered around climate change gatherings. So we can do that, and we should do that. If you have a platform, a voice, such as I do, we need to lend it to those without one. In my role as a senator, I've sought to do this by actively consulting with children and youth, to bring it into all aspects of the work I do, and to look for opportunities to amplify their voice. I believe that the federal advocate would be one way we could structurally build that in to the way we work at the Senate, at the levels of government, and across Canada. If you think on the corporate side, we need to include youth on boards. I worked with a not-for-profit organization for many years that had a youth position on the board that was protected. It was a voice that was there, and individuals who came on, we always had the voice of youth at the table. And I've subsequently been in other boards where I've tried to help build that capacity within the board and met a lot of resistance. So there is work to be done there around that. In organizations such as hospitals, where we recently, in the past decade, brought in patient advocates, we need youth advocates in those positions. And so the state of youth report really is a reminder that youth are very aware and engaged, more so than ever, and that they're passionate. We have 2 examples here, are passionate about having a say in their future, that they can lead, and that they are seeking opportunities to lead, that they can participate in the parliamentary process, that they can participate in the political process. We can fix that by lowering the voting age at a legislative level. So there are things that we can do. What we need to know and to make sure that we do is give them the space and the time and the resources to do this.
Thank you, Senator Moodie. So that definitely, certainly things that parliamentarians can do, and that actually, but we can all find ways to amplify youth voices, whatever we do, and including us as professors. This is something we can do, and including also youth in research. So I'm just realizing that we almost at the end of a time allocated for this event. I wanted to check, Christine, if there's any simple, short question from the public that we may ask to the panelists, or do we need to close? I'm not sure. I'll leave this to you.
Well, thank you, Mona. There are two really interesting questions, and we could perhaps try to ask both, but we'll see how the time goes. But the first one is asking, when Canada recently amended the Federal Sustainable Development Act, one of the main recommendations for changes was the creation of an independent advocate for future generations to help support the implementation of intergenerational equity. This was not included in the revised SDA. What, if anything, do you think this says about the federal government's willingness to incorporate the voices of youth, children, and future generations in public policy and governance?
I'm going to start with that. Is that fine? I think a lot of time it's really performative inclusion of youth, where it's like, look, I'm listening to youth, but that's it. And I think that's a prime example of that, where they promise us inclusion, but we don't get it. They promise to listen to our voices, but our cries just fall on deaf ears. And I think that happens especially at the federal government level, or general government level.
Taylor, would you like to go ahead?
Yes.
I was honestly going to say along the lines of Jana, yeah, it just seems like they're checking a box. And I think, I think maybe like an advisory committee of youth might, like for the specific question or this example, I wish I knew more about what the Sustainable Development Act is. But yeah, that would just be my recommendation in my thoughts.
So I have a comment, and it has to do with putting in place the supports to ensure that the voice of youth are systematically and structurally incorporated. And as the person who's raised the question has pointed out, in this situation that was lost, we have to find ways as a country to build that into our infrastructure, to build that structurally into our parliament, into our leadership, whether it be of nations, whether it be of groups of people. We need to find ways to provide that leadership in a way that it doesn't go away, that it's there all the time, and that the main role of it is to advocate for the voice of youth and to hold people to task to include them. I think the willingness to do that in a systematic and reliable way is where we have fallen short. And we need to make sure that we don't give ourselves the choice in the future moving forward, that we can avoid having the youth voice at the table, that we can avoid considering the impact on youth. I think we have to do it, and we have to find ways to allow us to work these advocates from various groups to find a way to work together, so that the end goal is that our youth are protected, that their lifestyle is improved, and that they do have a voice in the future of this country. And sometimes we get bogged down with who has the power and authority over whom. I think we have to find ways to work together to make sure that we put in place the important safeguards that ensure that youth are never forgotten for the future.
Thank you for your responses. There are two other questions in the Q&A. One is related to the implications or recommendations related to the implications of this prolonged exposure of social media, and another one related to the Lundy model to help conceptualize child participation. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but perhaps we can continue with that conversation in other spaces. But I would like to thank the speakers, Senator Moodie, Jana, and Taylor, for their very insightful comments that were shared today. I know that we will all carry these messages and important insights into both our personal as well as professional spaces. And we'd like to thank the Public Law Center for their collaboration with our interdisciplinary research laboratory on the rights of the child and the Faculty of Law, and to thank the technicians who assisted us today, as well as to all of the attendees who participated. So we thank you.
Thank you.